Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my Worlds 2025 quarterfinals day number 3 overview and analysis video. It's time for the West's final stand at this tournament. This is their last chance to continue onwards and to really break the tradition that has been set in recent memory where, yeah, one Western team can make the quarterfinals, but can they actually pick up a win here in the quarterfinals? The draw was at least kind of favorable, I would say, overall to them. Certainly not perfect, but I'm excited to go over it nonetheless. I hope you guys are excited as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect from this series, and did it live up to your expectation? Always curious to know your thoughts and opinions down there. But of course, go ahead and please check out my quarterfinals preview video that I did before any of the games. We of course already covered the first 2 days of the quarterfinals, both of the, I guess, lower part of the bracket series here. No lower bracket, only single elimination. Very hot topic in the league community right now. But if you want to check out our content and our videos on the other 2 quarterfinals, on any of the world stuff or the preview video, again, go ahead and check that out on the channel. But today, we've got a very big one that I'm very excited for, and I can't wait to get into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do in today's video is go game by game in this best of 5, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover. At the end of the video, we will be taking a look at the bracket and just kind of going over, what this means moving forward, who I think is looking good, give a slight preview for the final quarterfinals matchup that we are going to get here. But most of today is going to be spent talking about the game we got themselves. So let's talk about the matchup, shall we? I've kind of been alluding to it and previewing it. We even went really in depth in that previous primer video, but it's finally time to see whether or not the West can get it done and get back to the semifinals. It's a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LEC and G2 Esports and the number 3 seed from the LPL in Top Esports. Of course, both of these teams coming in from pretty different perspectives, both of them having their lumps, taking their lumps, I should say, throughout a lot of 2025. G2 did not win a single LEC title until the summer split. That doesn't sound all that crazy, considering like it's totally fine to, not be champions as long as you can get it done in the end, but that's strange for G2 of all teams. This is an Oregon, a team that has consistently been able to dominate European domestic play, and that was really not the case for a majority of this year. There were large sections of the year where I think you could say this was the 3rd or even 4th best team in the LEC in terms of the production that they were putting out on the Rift, and a lot of that was because of their one-dimensional playstyle that we kind of criticized for a lot of 2025, especially on this channel. I was very vocal about how I think G2 was really only relying on the fact that their hands were better than the players that they were playing into to be able to pick up wins domestically. But I do think this team made a lot of progress towards the end of the year. The summer split was obviously their best by far. It really did feel like they were able to control the game a lot better in the mid game, and that's really what separated them. They used to kind of just be late game team fight merchants and really had no way of getting there consistently. That's why they struggled so much at MSI, but it did seem like they figured something out after that tournament that really let them lock in for the rest of the year. They come to Worlds, and while it doesn't look pretty, and honestly, if you followed my channel, I don't rate their performance at this tournament particularly highly. It's good enough to be able to get past some other teams that are underperforming at a crazy high level. Their schedule on paper is strong. They've had to play some really good teams at this tournament, beating Billy Gaming and of course beating FlyQuest to be able to qualify for the quarterfinals here. But when you go and watch those games themselves, a lot of the problems that cropped up for G2 at the beginning of the year, they're very much still there for this team. I think they struggle to be able to, consistently get leads in the early game, and that's because this team is probably the slowest and most passive team at this entire tournament. They're certainly in the running for that with, teams like 100 Thieves that would be a lot farther away from a potential quarterfinals appearance, but if they can get to the mid game, that's where they've taken that big leap. While their early games still aren't very good, while Skewmond is still way too passive in the early game for my liking, their mid game skirmishes and their ability to play around objectives, I think, has gotten a lot better, and that's what's really gotten them here to the quarterfinals. I'm excited to see if that leap has been taken and if they've just maybe gotten lucky with some of the opponents, underperforming, or, if alternatively, maybe it was more luck than it was like evolution. That's going to be the big question here. I think they're talented enough to be able to go up against top Esports. Specifically, you have to be looking at that mid lane matchup. That is the one role here where I can genuinely say I just think G2 has the better player. In this matchup, I think Caps is better than Cream. I did put them side by side in terms of my rankings. I think Caps was at like number 6, and I think Cream is at number 7 in terms of my mid lane rankings going into this tournament, but essentially, I would say that Caps has got a higher ceiling. I would certainly say he has a higher floor and a more versatile champion pool in terms of what he's been able to perform on specifically here at the end of 2025, but he's going to have to be able to express that. If this team is not playing around Caps, I'm not sure I'm looking at a ton of other individual matchups and saying that G2 has the better player. I think Skewmond is a very worrisome matchup into Kanavi. We'll talk about that in a bit when we preview Top Esports. And then Broken Blade, while he can be fine on the top side, this has been a weaker year for him, all things considered. He's been very good at this tournament. I think he's been one of the better performing G2 players at Worlds so far, but he's going to have to keep that up. Hans and Labrov have their work cut out for them, but if Labrov in particular can get out on the map and be more aggressive, that's where Top Esports can lose a lot of their momentum with Hong on the other side. So Caps, Labrov, I think are the two most important players for G2 and the ones I'm going to be watching in this series. As for Top Esports, on the other side of this, they're basically the antithesis of G2 in every possible way, in the sense that they started off the year incredibly hot. They go to the first stand tournament by winning the LPL in the winter split, and they just cannot do anything there. They can't really find their form back. They really underperform in the spring split playoffs, getting 5th, 6th place, which is a ridiculous outcome for the #1 seed going into that playoff run. And it really takes a while for them to rebuild that reputation, but throughout all of this year, they've had a couple of players that have just been performing at a ridiculous level. Kanavi was the MVP of the LPL in the spring split, and to me, he was the runner-up in the summer split. I know people, were more on the Jackie Love side of that. He ended up getting the official summer split MVP in the LPL, but I think Kanavi has really been the anchor for Top Esports. He continues to be one of the best junglers in the world, one of the most underrated players in the entire world by far. I put him, I believe, number 7 in my top 10 player or my top 20 players at Worlds list, and people were not happy about him being that high. I think he's kind of lived up to that so far at this tournament, and he's got a chance to get his team into top 4. The big reason why I think this matchup is specifically good for TES and Kanavi, and why I consider them like polar opposites of G2, is while G2 is a really bad team in the early game, they're very slow, and they want to try and get to these 5v5 team fights. Top Esports is basically all early game. They don't really have a consistent late game. They're kind of LPL incarnate in that sense, where Kanavi is probably the best early game jungler in the world at being able to generate resources and getting his laners and himself into great positions. But if this team has to play from neutral, they're not very clinical at being able to play out those game states. And so it's going to be up to Kanavi to see if he can take advantage of the fact that Skewmond is a very slow and passive player in the early game and start to generate those big leads. Jackie Love, of course, the other player that I think you have to point out, the narrative definitely on his side, because this could potentially be his last Worlds ever with all the health issues mounting for him. We don't know if he's going to be back next year, but he was the MVP of the LPL split. Not for me, but for a lot of other people he was, and I think for official broadcast, he ended up getting that vote as well. He is in good form right now. He's been very good at this tournament, and if he's going to step up and just kind of dominate Hansama, which you would expect in a matchup like this, that is another big feather in the cap of Top Esports. 369 hopefully can stabilize on the top side, but you have to get good performances out of Cream and Hong. We talked about Caps and Labrov on the other side of this matchup. If you're losing the mid and support, kind of battle in this series, if G2 is able to get pressure through those roles in particular, Top Esports might not even have the ability to play through Kanavi in the way that they might want, or play through Jackie Love in the way they might want. So while I definitely favor Top Esports in this series, I don't necessarily think it's a cakewalk for them. I believe when I predicted this in my primer video, I believe I gave it 70-30, or around like 65-35 in favor of Top Esports. I think that is fair. I think that this is less obvious than Genji versus HLE was, but I also think it's the second most lopsided quarterfinals matchup. I think Top Esports are pretty big favorites coming into this, and G2 winning would be an upset, but it's not impossible. Certainly an opportunity for G2 to break the mold and get the West back into the semifinals. Can they do it? Well, the only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. And they looked awesome here in game number 1. Basically, everything you could want to see out of TES absolutely came to fruition in this first game, where their draft is very Top Esports coded. You get a melee mid assassin in Akali for Cream. In the mid lane, you have Jackie Love on something that's very stable, but also has early game power, and Kanavi as a skirmisher that has initiation potential here with the Wukong. It's basically everything that Top Esports like to play around. They don't even fret all that much about trading Wukong for Orianna, which, by the way, I am going to continue to lambast. I know that people have kind of pushed back on that. that online. Maybe not so much in my comment section. It seems like most people tend to agree with the fact that Orianna is very strong right now, but if this isn't the game to prove to you how strong Orianna is, I don't know what is. Caps played absolutely miserable. He had terrible positioning, was constantly in the wrong place at the wrong time on the map, and still almost completely turned the game around just because this champion is so busted. Like, I cannot fathom giving Orianna over. If G2 like had any ability to play around a Jarvan in any way, shape, or form, like this would have been a slam dunk pick, literally, in terms of the Cataclysm coming in, and I think G2 would have had a much better chance of being able to win this game, but Skumon just is not a good Jarvan player, and they clearly don't trust him on it. It goes completely unpicked and unbanned with Orianna, Rel, Corki on the side of G2, and that's how you know it's just not necessarily something they were even looking at, so Top Esports ends up being able to capitalize on a mid lane matchup that is more comfortable for Top Esports, and then just kind of move out from there. And that's really what it ended up being. It was all these small skirmishes that just ended up being in Top Esports' favor. You know, things were relatively even for parts of this game, but even at the most like even trading standpoint from a fights perspective, when you're trading 2 for 2 or 3 for 3, TES was always walking out of it being able to pick something else up on the other side of the map and just slowly accumulating this 2-3K gold lead until they just blew the game wide open. This is kind of the prototypical Top Esports experience where it just kind of feels like you're being pulled apart because they're so greedy on how they play the map, and eventually you just don't have the gold to be able to keep up. For Top Esports player of the game for me is going to go to Cream. Hard to go in a different direction. 11 kills on Akali in game number 1. This is a classic Cream pick. In fact, I would say it's the classic pick for him in the mid lane, kind of going back to his OMG days. This is what he was always known for as a champion, and boy, did he make the most of it here in game number 1. Fun fact, Cream in his career has never lost on Akali going into Orianna, which is just a ridiculous stat. I mean, that is something that seems incomprehensible, but it's just how comfortable he feels playing this matchup, and it's why I think G2 felt, or Top Esports, I should say, felt so comfortable giving over the Orianna on red side, because they knew that this Akali could just kind of take advantage of this matchup. You knew that Cream was going to be comfortable playing the 1v1 against Caps, and boy, if we highlighted like in the preview and in the primer video that we put out that Caps kind of needed to step up and be the better mid laner in order for G2 to win this series, well, that's a problem because Cream absolutely dumpstered G2 in game number 1. He was even playing way too over aggressive. He got himself caught out twice. Both of his deaths in this game were completely avoidable with just him being either way too early on a fight on the top side or just going back in for no reason after he picked up a 1v2 kill. Like, if he doesn't do either of those things, this is a deathless, dominant game from, you know, Cream on this Akali, and we're talking about a player that's really starting to take over in the quarterfinals. As it is, he still was by far the most effective and most dominant player on the Rift, but certainly not the only player on Top Esports that I think played well. 369 was excellent in this game on the Mbessa. Every single ultimate was landed on a priority target early on in fights to be able to lock them up. This Mbessa was very, very tough to deal with. I think there is a strong case for 369 to actually be player of the game for game number 1. I'm going to lean a little bit more towards Cream because I think his damage was a bit underappreciated by the commentators in this series or in this game number 1, but 369 was absolutely excellent. This Mbessa was huge, and if the solo laners are stepping up, if it's not even Kanavi or Jackie Love that we're talking about first for Top Esports being able to pick up a dominant win in game 1, that is a bit of a problem, because Kanavi was still very good. In fact, he cleaned up a lot of mistakes that the other players on this team ended up making. His macro is just so much better, and we'll get to Skumon on the other side. This is the concern, right? Skumon played like a complete passenger in this game, and Kanavi had every bit of pressure on the map, and he's going to do more with that than almost any other jungler in the world. Jackie Love and Hong were good, not the main characters. Jackie Love had a couple of really big fights, and Hong, I think, was relevant, but overall, this was a solo lane dominant game where Kanavi had a ton of really nice engages to be able to capitalize on a G2 team that really wanted to continue to clump up over, like, it's just one of those games. It's really not, it's not good from G2, but it's really well executed from Top Esports, and it does go to show why they were favorites going into this series. But for G2 on the other side, dud of the game was very, very easy for me. That is going to Skumon in the jungle. Did not really have to think about this all that much. This is the Skumon that I have been warning people about. He is such a passenger in terms of how he plays the game. He sat here and watched Kanavi get a giant lead on Wukong playing Xin Zhao and did absolutely nothing about it. Every time I see him lock in this champion, I just assume things are not going to go well for G2 because Xin Zhao needs to skirmish in order to be as relevant as he needs to be in the early and in the mid game. Skumon was late to a majority of fights, and even when he was trying to contest objectives, he wasn't setting up properly for them. He's just not a good early game player. Like, he doesn't feel comfortable in that stage of the game. I don't know if it's confidence confidence. I don't know if it's just a lack in experience playing at a top tier level, like whatever it is, or maybe it's just like an inherent thing that he's not good at as a player. It's a problem for G2. Like what I've been comparing him to on this channel is, and this is going to come off as a really weird comparison, but honestly, he reminds me so much of like Xmithy back in the day where, Xmithy would be able to stall games out playing tanks and be able to be this like objective merchant down the stretch in North America and even internationally when he found success. But the problem for Skewmond is he's not playing the same game that Xmithy played back in 2015. Like, this is a very different version of League of Legends than what it was a decade ago, and you're just not capable of getting away with the passive play that he's had over the past, couple of months, and he's getting exposed for it right now against Kanavi. He's got to change in game number 2, where G2, I think, is in a bad spot. Everybody else on this team was also kind of bad. Hans didn't really get to do anything. Broken Blade also kind of just didn't get to play the game. Labrov got caught out on multiple occasions, did find some nice picks, but overall it was almost always traded for his own life, which is never really all that great. Caps got some kills, but boy, was this guy's positioning terrible in this game. Like, he was just always in the wrong place at the wrong time. He needed to space a lot better. He still was able to get away with a ton of it, especially that shockwave in the mid lane, just because Orianna is so broken as a champion. But on anything else, this is an even bigger stomp in terms of top esports, and I think that's the concern for G2, is now you've kind of utilized your big Orianna game that was able to get you past FlyQuest, and you don't have things like Labrov's Rel, a big pick for him moving forward, Hansama on something like Corki that can be very versatile. Like, you got to start picking the pace up, and for top esports, like, obviously you don't have a Kali, but there are plenty of other champions that these players play. Like, they haven't even gone to the well quite yet, so top esports looking pretty good, but it's just game number 1. If G2 can bounce back and win that second game, tie the series up at 1 apiece, anything can really happen when you turn this into a best of 3, so it's a must-win for G2. Can they be the first team in this quarterfinal stage to actually force a 1-1 scoreline, or will top esports take yet another dominant 2-0 series lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece here, and thank goodness we have a back and forth series for really the first time in the quarterfinals. Genji HLE was a banger, but it still was 2-0 at the end of the first 2 games. We finally have a series that is tied up going into a game number 3, and G2 looked significantly more comfortable here in this second game. This is really the G2 I think we've all been waiting on throughout large parts of this tournament, and I hate to say it, but it's clear what unlocks that, and that is this Dr. Mundo pick for Skewmond. We're going to get into just why I think this pick is so effective, but it's for basically everything that G2 wants to do. It helps in the early game because it's not really something you can take advantage of if you're an enemy jungler, especially when you're playing something like Kiana for Kanavi on the other side. It helps in the mid game because it has a very straightforward and clear direction for how it wants to fight and contest over objectives, and then in the late game, it just does what Skewmond wants to do. This is a great pick for how G2 play the game, and even more specific, it's a great pick for how Skewmond really wants to play the game. It really unlocks G2's best and most optimal playstyle, but for top esports, they just didn't really have the resources to ever break through this draft from G2. I think they did a great job of being able to draft something that gave them a ton of options, G2 that is, and TES, even with some great performances in the final fights out of Cream in the mid lane, who's having a great series right now on some melee mids, they just didn't have the firepower. And I'll be honest, man, Hong lost this game. Like, I'm going to try and make this more interesting than just saying that Hong's Alistar was constantly giving free gold over to G2 even when top esports was completely outplaying them in the mid game, but it is what it is, right? Like, we're going to talk about what G2 did right in the same vein. I'm not just going to put it all on Hong. Player of the game, obviously, for me, is going to Skewmond. This Dr. Mundo was the most relevant and important champion in the entire game, and it was not particularly close, but again, I kind of want to go in depth on why this is so successful. A lot of people are going to look at G2's games at this tournament and wonder why Dr. Mundo isn't played more. And while I do agree, I think this pick is more relevant than maybe a lot of Eastern teams are giving it credit for. A lot of LCK and LPL teams have never even really experimented with the Dr. Mundo throughout this year, which I think is a pretty big mistake. This is a perfect champion for G2 and the way that they want to operate the game. And that's for a couple of different reasons. I think mostly because this team obviously struggles in the early game, is good in the late game, but what it allows is for Skewmond to not have to be particularly proactive and actually get rewarded for it. Dr. Mundo was the kind of jungler where if you are just able to accumulate resources, and if your laners are kind of isolated on islands, and specifically in this game when you get good matchups, you have things like Galio into Rumble, you have the Lucian Bard going into the Sivir Alistar. When you get into these good situations, and we'll talk about how the bot lane went, because obviously so many resources were put into taking Jack Jackie Love out of this game, and they absolutely worked for TES and to get Hansama on the board, which kind of worked. We'll talk about Hansama as we go a little bit later, but when you allow Skewmon to not feel so much pressure to be the guy in the early game that actually creates the advantage for the team, if you can give him that security that he is going to be able to take over if you can buy enough time, then all of a sudden the game plan becomes significantly more linear and significantly more clear for this team, and I think that's what they really need. They don't need these big complicated win conditions where they have to win fights in the mid game in order to not surrender a gigantic gold lead. Picks like Xin Zhao have to be able to contest over objectives if he wants to be useful at all in the later part of the game. Dr. Mundo doesn't have that problem. It's a perfect pick for Skewmon as a player, and it's a perfect pick for how G2 have, gone about wanting to play at this tournament and really throughout all of this year. So yes, do I think Dr. Mundo is busted? Yeah, I think that there is a good argument that this champion is just overpowered. He's finally getting nerfs, and, hopefully he will be a little bit weaker going into next year. Thank you, Alois. But at the end of the day, Skewmon he is the perfect player to be playing Dr. Mundo in the jungle for how this champion operates in professional play, and we once again saw it here. I mean, he was able to dominate in the later part of the game, but he did have a good early game. We'll get to the negatives for G2. Their strategy was very clear. It's take this bot lane out of the game. Jackie Love was at level 1 when the rest of G2 was hitting level 3. I mean, it was nightmarish for this Sivir, unable to play this game under any circumstance. Dive after dive, and Hong making mistake after mistake just ended up taking this bot lane out of any contention for being relevant as this game continued to go along. Really big credit to Skewmon for that. I thought he played the early game well, but credit to Hansama and Labrov as well, who I don't think are going to get enough credit for being able to kind of push that forward in the same vein. Now, we got to talk about the big weakness here for G2, which is the fact that this game was over at 5 minutes into the game. Basically, from 5 to 10 minutes, there was absolutely zero reason for G2 to ever lose this game, and they threw it away in the mid game. They put themselves in a situation where if Hong wasn't making as many mistakes as he was and giving free gold back over to G2 at the end of this game, they probably lose this, which is just not a situation you should ever be in. This was not clean. This was actually, in fact, terrible. This is the bad version of G2 that we got for a majority of the year, where their mid games are just nightmarishly lackluster, where Top Esports was pulling them and diffing them in the macro sense around the entire map, and G2 really had no response for it. Again, credit to Hong for winning this game for G2, but this was not a clean game, despite the fact that it might look like one. Their early game was really good, and honestly, their 5v5 team fights were pretty solid as well. Top Esports did a good job of winning a couple of those because Cream was really strong on the Yone, but overall with no Sivir, it was really hard for them to play front to back. But G2's macro continues to be miserable when it matters the most, and that's something that I just don't think this team is ever going to be able to fix. That being said, they still ended up winning the game. Caps had a really big one on Rise. I haven't even brought him up yet. He had kind of an underratedly phenomenal game on Rise. He was huge in side lanes, and he was doing a ton of damage in team fights. He wasn't necessarily like what my eyes were being drawn to, but you definitely go back and rewatch those fights, and he is putting in a massive amount of work. Hansama was gifted like a 2,000 gold lead in this game and was still lackluster in team fights. I'm sorry, man. I'm just not buying in to the Hansama hype here, but it is what it is. Like, I can say all these negative things about G2. They win games. Like, they have won yet another game at Worlds, even if they didn't play perfect. This has kind of been symbolic of their run up until this point, where they're making mistakes and they're making the game much closer than it needs to be. And it does not need to be so back and forth when they're gifted such a big lead. But at the end of the day, they're the ones walking in and killing the Nexus. And that is all that matters in the end to tie up the series. But for Top Esports on the other side, obviously you're frustrated with the way that they ended up going about this game, because they threw away the early game. They did everything they needed to do. Kanavi, 369, Cream having a great mid game to be able to get TES back in it, and Hong just refusing to let the team win. I mean, just inting over and over and over again. This is absolutely the game to forget for Hong. He's done of the game without any sort of doubt. I mean, he actively sabotaged TES's chances of winning this. I genuinely think if you put an average support performance in this game, Top Esports probably end up winning it, because they had full momentum and full control until Hong just kept being over aggressive and kept flashing in as if he was, an assassin on this Alistar trying to pick up kills, and it was just absolutely terrible from him. It really was one of those games where if they end up going down in this series, or G2 comes back and wins it or anything like that, like, Hong is going to be the one to blame, because this series probably should be 2-0, but he just did not allow it to happen. Jackie Love was not in this game at all after dominating Hans in game number 1 in terms of the 2v2. They really realized, like, hey, what if we just play towards the Hansama lane? That was something that we've done at Worlds in previous years, and in this game, it definitely worked. Jackie Love was completely eliminated from having any sort of pressure throughout this game, and he had no gold. Now, Top Esports, again, still almost came back. Cream is looking phenomenal. He's been the best player in this series so far across past the first 2 games. Yes, they're on melee mids, and that pool is, basically gone at this point in terms of the relevant assassins. Akali and Yone, definitely 1A and 1B. Not that either are particularly strong right now, but basically nobody else in that class of champions is all that relevant, maybe outside of Sylas, if you're going to let something like that through. But Cream has looked good so far this series, and I definitely think that that is an important note. Kanavi, I think, had a couple of good fights, just didn't have the damage on the Kiana in the end, and 369 is playing really well. Top Esports have reasons to not be concerned, but it's tied up at 1 apiece. It doesn't really matter how you got there. You have to go out here and win game number 3. This turns into a best of 3. This is the most important game of the series. The winner of this is going to have full control for the rest of the quarterfinals. And that could go to either Top Esports or G2 now, who have given themselves a chance to get back into the driver's seat. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1 and take full control away from G2. And this was a game. This was one of the games of all time. I'm not going to say it was a fun or a good game. This game was incredibly boring. It was very slow. There wasn't really a lot of action going on. And honestly, typically in that particular instance, that's kind of G2's dream in the quarterfinals, is for basically nothing to happen in the early game against any team and to just hope and pray that they can get to the later part of the game at relatively neutral gold so they can win some team fights. But this draft is not necessarily indexing them in that direction. You drafted Renekton and Caitlyn, which does kind of signal that you want to get a pretty big early gold lead, and while Hansama was able to get quite a few plates, that's like the bare minimum for Caitlyn as a champion. From that point onwards, they were making bad map rotations. They were gift wrapping every single major objective over to Top Esports, which I'm very excited to talk about because I think that's ultimately where things ended up going, monstrously wrong. We'll just say for G2, and then TES win one gigantic fight around the Soul, and Aatrox is unkillable. Like, you have no damage to be able to break through this guy in the late game. So credit to TES, I guess, for taking it slow. They understood that they were going to be able to play the later part of this game basically no matter what, and they never really felt rushed because, again, you're going into Renekton, Caitlyn, even with things like Ivern and Sylas on the other side. Like, they're never going to be able to 1v9 things like Trundle and Aatrox in the later part of the game. You're not necessarily set up into a position where you feel scared to go back into the end game neutral, but at the same time, like, it's not like you're losing by playing the game the way that you did all through the mid game, not just because you win the team fights late, but because what was G2's game plan? All right, sure, you know what we're going to do to avoid fights and get to the late game? Give every single dragon over to Top Esports basically uncontested throughout the entire game. They got 3 of them entirely for free, and then in the Soul fight, they lost the Soul. They got Ocean Soul and Aatrox Trundle, and the game is over. Like, there's no way to play from that point onwards. So just kind of a macro disaster class from G2, and not really a lot to talk about on that front for Top Esports. Like, yeah, this was another Aatrox versus G2 moment. 369 is getting player of the game. Do I think it was quite as dominant as maybe it has been in some other instances of these champions going in, or of this champion in particular going into G2? No, I think this was more so like Aatrox was there and then he won a fight and then they couldn't kill him and then the game was over, right? Like, it's just kind of a standard Aatrox game on that front. It was more so G2 just had no way of dealing with this champion in the mid game where he's supposed to be taken advantage of, and by the time you hit the late game, this guy was basically a free win because you have zero way of actually killing him once he has Ocean Soul. So yeah, credit to 369. He was strong, and I'm certainly not trying to take anything away from him, but I don't think he was, like, unstoppable in the same way that maybe we've seen from, like, the Shy versus G2. This was definitely a bit of a different experience. I think Jackie Love and Hong deserve a lot of credit. I think Jackie Love's positioning throughout this game was really solid. He was basically the only one playing consistently aggressive, I would say, for Top Esports. Most of this game was spent with him arcane shifting forward to try and deal as much damage as possible because G2 was not willing to try and risk resources to take the Ezreal out of his game. Like, I get the Caitlyn pick because you are at least attempting to push the tempo of this game high, but Ezreal Karma is so consistent. They're going to be good early. They're going to be able to trade on other parts of the map if you index too heavily into Caitlyn and to Thresh, and then obviously they're just going to be more useful in the mid game, which is exactly what we saw. Kanavi and Cream were fine. Cream ended up doing 1 billion damage in the late game because he was never contested, and Kanavi was there. Like, he got every dragon. Good job. Like, that was his job this game, and he clearly accomplished it. But Top Esports didn't really have to do all that much. They were basically gift wrapped a good game state for them to be able to win, and they happily took it. And for G2, like, what happened in this game? Like, this is probably the most important game of the entire year for them, and they sat there and watched themselves lose and did absolutely nothing about it. Like, this is just bad. Like, I don't really know what else to say. There's not really a lot of positives that I can give this team here. They played some of the fights okay. I'm not going to say every play they went for in the early game was bad. Skewmond was at the very least attempting to do things on the Ivern on the top side. They got the 3 Grubs and they got Rift Herald, which I guess is a fair enough trade as long as you, I don't know, don't give 3 Dragons over completely for free to top esports, because by the time you need to fight in the later part of the game, now you don't have the stats to actually deal with the comp that's better than you on the other side. But really the biggest negative has got to be Labrov in the support position. This was a terrible Thresh angle and it was a bad Thresh game. I think this champion is really bad right now. I think that there are so many things that have to go right for Thresh to feel relevant as a support in the current meta. I get that Lantern is a very strong ability, but the hook is just worse than every other hook champion in the game right now. And even the Lantern is just, everybody gets 8,000 wards now because of trinkets. Like, that's a big reason why Thresh has fallen off in modern League's popularity, is it's so much easier to make, Lantern less relevant if you're trying to get a player who's in danger out of danger. You can just, again, drop a ward onto the Lantern, all of a sudden that champion isn't nearly as useful. Also, the guy had like 20 souls by the end of the game. People were even memeing about it on Twitter, where it's like, it was actually tactical. He didn't collect souls so that Trundle couldn't ult him and steal all his stats away. Like, if we're at that point with the Thresh, the pick ended up failing in pretty much every major way. So terrible game from Labrov. Not really a good series so far from him. He was a big key to success for this team. And Caps has just been completely outplayed this entire series. He's had absolutely no pressure in the mid lane. This is a very aggressive matchup, the first actually aggressive matchup that he's had throughout this series, and he spent the entire time in side lanes collecting waves, even when he really shouldn't have. Like, you can say, oh, it's not necessarily his fault that the team was losing around him, but like, he's not generating resources. He's going down in CS in the 1v1 in lane, and then he's basically doing nothing for the rest of the game. This has been a completely lackluster series from the one player that kind of needed to be better than his opposition. Cream has absolutely been better than Caps in and out of lane in this series, and it just makes it so hard. Against Skewmond, doesn't have Dr. Mundo anymore because of Fearless, and that concerns me because it's really been the champion that they found the consistent success on throughout this, tournament, and the only one that they've looked like good in games on. Like, they've won other games, but that's the only one where Skewmond's been able to find like actual good games consistently. Hansama just seems like he's not going to be able to carry this team, which we kind of knew was going to be the case. Broken Blade was on Renekton. He can't 1v9, and 369 is a better player. This is a scary game number 3 because their macro was torn apart. I think their draft ideology is not very good, and it does feel like this team kind of has a bit of a cap in terms of what their ceiling can be. But again, that's kind of what we were saying coming out of game number 1, and yet they won game 2. If they can win game 4 and push themselves to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, anything can happen in a best of 1. But Top Esports do not want to allow that. They want to close it out here. Will they be able to? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to take this series 3-1, and they will be pushing themselves as the official first LPL team to make the semifinals of the World Championships this year. Congratulations to Top Esports. They looked great in this series. There are so many things to praise, so many players that I think had great series. There are 2 in particular, 2.5 that I really want to give a big shout out to, and really prop up for their performances, because I think that there were some questions about whether or not they were going to be able to play up to the biggest standard that everybody had anticipated for them. But unfortunately, this does mean it is the end for G2 Esports, for the LEC, and for every non-LCK or LPL team at this tournament. They were the final one, alongside, of course, the Flying Oysters, to make the quarterfinals, neither of them being able to advance. But G2 did pick up a game win, which is something CFO was not able to do. That being said, unfortunately for G2 in this series, I think they had more in common with CFO losing to KT than maybe HLE, who lost to Genji earlier, because it really did feel like they were just outplayed in this series. It did not feel like they were on the same level as Top Esports, and I think there are some big questions about what this team and what this region is going to do moving forward. But I want to make it clear, just as I had for the other 2 teams that had been eliminated at this tournament, this is a huge, huge success for G2. I don't think anybody looking at this as a disappointment has any relevance in terms of a conversation, because, like, really, this is probably best case scenario for how G2's year went. This team did not look competitive for large portions of this year. It really took them the back end of the year to figure things out and actually be a team that felt like they could even come close to this kind of result. And even then, me and even other analysts were skeptical on whether or not this team was going to make it out of the Swiss stage. They make it out of the Swiss stage, and they take 1 game in the quarterfinals against a Top Esports team that was always better than everybody was giving them credit for. This is a good result for how G2's year went, especially with the talent on their roster. But We'll get into that at the end of the segment here. We talk about the winning teams first, so let's talk about it. Player of the game for Game 4 is pretty obviously going to Kanavi on the Naafiri. This was a staple LPL carry Naafiri kind of game. We didn't really get this on the Kiana in game number 2 because he had to play into a Dr. Mundo, but in this one he had free reign to move around the map and be really aggressive, and Kanavi made the absolute most of it. This is the player I expected to get basically the entire series in terms of how things broke down. I thought he was really going to be able to take over and kind of dominate Skewmond and really be able to kind of push that map state forward, but wasn't really able to do that until I would say game 4 here. Game number 1 was still very good from him. In game 3, obviously Skewmond gave everything over, but that game was very slow. Kanavi really dominated this one. He was able to control the whole map, and the dogs were barking in terms of, you know, getting the LPL to the semifinals. It's pretty poetic, honestly, that the LPL gets their first semifinals representative off the back of a Naafiri game in game number 4 with how this year has gone, but Kanavi was nowhere near player of the series for me. He ended up getting it on broadcast. Again, I just disagree with that. Player of the series very much feels like a player of game number 4 award right now on the official Worlds broadcast, which I wholeheartedly disagree with. But player of the series for me might shock some people. I'm giving it to Cream in the mid lane. I think he was the best player on the Rift for Top Esports here today. I think he was better than Caps in basically all 4 games. I mean, game number 2, obviously you can, you know, give some, you know, credit to Caps for how he played in the end of that game and being able to kind of help the team win some team fights, but at the end of the day, like the Rise was not dominant in the early game, and Cream still had a great performance on the Yone. In every other game, it's inarguable Cream was better than Caps, both in and out of lane. I really do think he was just excellent here today. He goes deathless on the Victor in this final game. Not a champion he's particularly associated with, but one that he definitely made use of in this game. I really just think he was great across all of the tape, even going back and rewatching the team fights here for the second time around. He was phenomenal. Like, this guy just played really well today, and if he's going to play like this team has a much better shot of getting to the finals than I think anybody gives them credit for, which we'll talk about a bit more at the end of this segment. But 369 was the other player I considered for player of the series. It probably should go to one of the 2 solo laners. 369 had some unbelievably good setups here on the Gnar, especially for Kanavi. His KDA ended up being a lot better because of the way 369 played on this Gnar champion. He was targeted a ton by G2 in side lanes to try and take advantage of him. It's why his deaths are the highest on the team, but even in the situations where G2 was pumping resources into killing him at the end of the game, he still was able to turn things around and set things up for the rest of his team. His ultimates were spectacular in this game, and I think we can put to rest the 369 Gnar jokes. I think even PSG Talent's official Twitter account tweeted out, you know, Karsa being like, oh shit, this guy plays Gnar. Like, you know, just capitalizing on the meme. But I think 369 and Cream were the best players here today. Jackie Love and Hong were fine. Jackie Love was pretty good, I would say, throughout this series. Didn't have to do all that much. Certainly wasn't the main character. Hong was miserable in game number 2, and I'm not going to forget that, but, you know, the rest of the series, I would say he was generally fine. This is not an upset. Top Esports was expected to be the better team here today, and they absolutely were. They get themselves to the semifinals, and you know what? I feel pretty vindicated right now, just in terms of how things have been going. I've been praising this team all year long. I have been spending so much time on this channel, both in the LPL weekly recaps and then in the international, you know, preparations, telling people that this team is better than they think they are. And, you know, people got really mad at me when I talked about the, you know, 2-1 section, Top Esports being the best team in the second best team outside of Gen.G in the 2-1 section. Well, now they're in the semifinals of Worlds. This is inarguably a top 5-ish team in the world. Like, I don't really think you can put them much lower than that. If you want to say a team like Hanwha Life is better than them, I think that's your prerogative, but, you know, I really think that they have earned their place in the top 4 at this point, and I think it's pretty clear to me that they are in the running for being the best LPL team. We'll see how anyone's legend fares tomorrow against T1, but for G2 on the other side, again, it's really hard to be pessimistic for me considering what my expectations for this team were, and I think generally what the expectations for this region were. I know I was a bit disconnected, but it's really hard for me not to look at this G2 team and see 2024 FlyQuest and 2023 NRG and, you know, the Western team that makes it out but doesn't really have like a real shot of getting to the semifinals. It does kind of feel like G2 is just that team this year where they didn't really have the complete roster. Like, Caps is a good player, but he wasn't very good here today. Hansama and Broken Blade are not the kind of veterans that can elevate the team, and Lebrav and Skewmond, I think, kind of proved that their limited skill sets can be taken advantage of in a high-pressure environment. Like, getting here in the first place case, this is a good result for G2 and for the LEC, and I'm hopeful that in the same way that it kind of propped up FlyQuest to feel more confident this year to make the quarterfinals last year, that it could do the same for G2. Now, obviously, they didn't have the same kind of series that Fly had against Gen G, but that's not necessarily a different scenario. If this team can make a couple of tweaks, I imagine this roster is going to look quite different going into next year, whether it's a new support or whether it's, a complete overhaul of the bot lane or whatever. Top lane might need to change. You might want to go in a different direction. I'm not saying they should. I'm just saying I expect there to be changes for G2 this offseason, and I think there's a reasonable expectation that this could be the re-emergence of G2 as a premier organization, and this could be the first step in building a roster that is worthy of making it back to the semifinals and then hopefully for them eventually the finals. But it was not meant to be here today. This 2025 roster was never going to be good enough to be able to accomplish that. Unfortunately, I think that is just kind of the reality of the players, and I think part of that is Labrov, who just isn't, he's not a quarterfinals level player. Like, he's just not. He's dead of the game here in game number 4. I love Labrov. I think that there is a lot to like about him as a player. He is a very limited skill set. Again, very similar to Skewmon. He does one thing at a really high level, which is team fight. He hit a couple of big pop blossoms in this game, but he was also drastically out of position in between those team fights, and it's just something that limited skill set is kind of always not going to be enough when you're trying to play the best teams in the world, and we saw him just get exposed at the end of the series where he was just not good enough. Again, Caps was pretty bad. I think all things considered here today, he needed to be better than Cream, and he just wasn't. We highlighted Caps and Labrov as the two players that were the most important for G2 to step up, and neither of them were capable of doing that. Skew looked great on the Dr. Mundo, looked incredibly passive on everything else. What else is there to say about Skewmon? You know my thoughts. I think he is a limiting player in terms of what your ceiling can look like. I don't know if you can ever be a top 4 team in the world with someone like Skewmon in the jungle unless he progresses, and I'm willing to give him another year or to give him some time to prove that he can become a player that is more versatile, that he can kind of grow into a well-rounded, very mechanically skillful player. But right now it really does feel like he is a one-trick pony in terms of his playstyle, not in terms of his champion pool. And I think that might just be a bit of a problem for G2. We'll see if that continues. You guys know my thoughts on Hans. I think Hans is just not a world's caliber or a world-class player. I think he's a world's caliber player, but I don't think he's a world-class AD carry. He was super, accelerated, I will say, on the Draven, and they never really played around him. This game is not his fault. This series really is not his fault, but he also wasn't great. It's not like he changed the game or anything with the resources he got. And Broken Blade had the worst year I would say he's had since he joined G2 in 2025. There are so many things that this team needs to fix, but if I'm saying all that and they still were able to overachieve what they've done over the past couple of years, this is the first time they've made it out of the quarterfinal or out of the Swiss stage into the quarterfinals in years. I believe the last time it must have been 2020, right? Like, that was the last time they made the quarterfinals of Worlds. And if that's the case, like, this is a success. Getting back into the top 8 is certainly something that you can be proud of. I just think you can go even higher than here if you make slight tweaks and slight changes to this roster, and I'm excited to see what they do moving forward. But for Top Esports, again, this team moves on to top 4. This is a good result for them as well. I'm not saying their journey is stopping here, by the way. We're going to do some semifinals previews in later videos, but this team is good enough to beat both AL and T1. I think that's fair to say. Maybe they're not going to be favorites going into either of those series, although they did kind of crush anyone's legend in the domestic playoffs, and so, you might feel pretty good about that matchup, but, T1 obviously is T1, especially if they get their confidence back in that next series. Whatever the case, I can understand that Top Esports isn't necessarily going to be viewed as a favorite to get to the finals, but it is not impossible for this team right now, with the way that they played here today, to be one of the best teams in the world, to prove everybody wrong. And they just took the biggest possible step to get there. All right, but that is going to do it for my Worlds 2025 quarterfinals day number 3 overview and analysis video. The bracket is updated up on your screen. Now we know 3 of our 4 semifinals participants here, Gen G and KT Rolster, of course, from the previous 2 days, and Top Esports joining them now on the top side of this bracket. We've got one more quarterfinals matchup to go over and to talk about and to play before we get into the semifinals. And don't forget, there's no break. The quarterfinals end tonight. The last series is taking place in, a couple of hours tonight, and then right the next day is the semifinals. So no break for these teams to be able to figure things out. It is now or never, but that final quarterfinal series is, in my opinion, the most interesting one. This is the one I gave a 50-50 in terms of my quarterfinals preview video. It's anyone's legend and T1. And I think this determines so much for the rest of this tournament because let's say T1 win this. Well, now Top Esports is the only LPL team, non-LCK team left. And they're probably what most people would consider to be the weakest team left at the tournament because they already lost to KT Rolster, a team that most people would have considered better than them, or that they would have been better than going into the tournament. And, you know, Gen G, T1, these are teams that are expected to do better than Top Esports at this tournament. And it's them up against the world. But if AL win, we are guaranteed an LPL team in the finals. It will be AL and Top Esports in the semifinals, and all of a sudden, Top Esports is facing a team that they just destroyed in the domestic playoffs. Everything becomes a lot more interesting. So this series actually really determines a lot of the narratives for the rest of this tournament, and boy, am I excited for it. You know, like I said, I think AL's been better at this tournament, but it's impossible to bet against T1 in a best-of-5 at Worlds, especially against an LPL team, so I'm betting T1. I hope this is the one series that actually does go the distance, because so far, all of these have, you know, kind of skirted around and avoided a lot of that. KT CFO and G2 Top Esports, I think, were, you know, a little bit anticlimactic in terms of how things went down. Gen G HLE was really fun up until game number 3, but hopefully this is the quarterfinals matchup that really starts to bring the heat. Let me know what you think. What do you think is going to happen in that series, and how do you think it makes the rest of the tournament look? Let me know down in the comment section below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We've been doing daily coverage of the World Championships all the way through this point, and that's not stopping. We're going to continue with the quarters, the semis, and then eventually the finals. The offseason is already rolling. The LEC is in full force, especially now with G2 eliminated. Really does feel like there's rumors popping out all the time. If you are interested in learning about offseason stuff once Worlds is over, we're going to be covering it on this channel, so all of that stuff. Hit subscribe, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all